don't. You don't, because I haven't sent it yet. I sent it after the class, right? Okay, so we are now recording. So hi everyone, this is Catherine Welford from BMC, and today we're going to be doing the advanced configuration training for EUEM. So pretty much everything that we didn't do last time, so everything underneath the administration tab, whereas last time we talked about all the bits that we look at to learn things about our traffic. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about traffic inclusion and exclusion policies. So as with everything, well, pretty much any monitoring thing, right? We always want to try and make sure that we're focusing on the things we care about and weed out all the stuff we don't care about. So we want to try and get as high a signal-to-noise ratio as possible. So there's a lot of things we can do to make sure that happens, right? So the bouncer at the door, that's the inclusion-exclusion policy. So that's what we include, what we exclude, and yada yada, okay? Obviously, in order to tell our stories, as most of you know, we work in the realm of objects and pages and sessions. So we're obviously going to need to figure out how do we actually go about putting those sessions together. So we're going to use sessionization for that. Page detection really is just labeling different objects, different things, so we can figure out, you know, are you a container, a component, or something else? So we do that, right? First public IP and geo, well, it's pretty much not rocket science, you'll see. Error detection rules, right? So slow is pretty easy. We set up a speed limit, and anything slow is slow. Errors, well, that's where we have conditions, right, for these error rules. So as we meet certain conditions, we will establish that things are errored, right? So if we see a 404 instead of a 200 OK, we know that's an error, okay? Custom fields, just about every field of data, not all of them, but just about every, field of data in EUEM can be configured and modified, right, to make sure that we're grabbing things the way we need to grab them to identify the things we need the way we need to identify them, right? Instead of just talking about what PCO and SLT are, so performance compliance levels and service level thresholds, we're actually going to show you how we set those, okay? We're also going to talk about AIM rules, which is a lot more complex than just describing them because it involves a whole lot of conditions and parameters we have to hit in order to consider something an incident, and what we actually tell you about it, and then what conditions we need to meet to actually tell you it's really important and send you an email or an SNMP trap, okay? LDAP, well, I'll just touch briefly on it, just on the mechanisms of it. Session data storage, so last time we told you in the basic nav, we told you that that was a function of how much traffic we're in front of, how big the hard drive is, how fat all the hits are. Today, we're going to be talking about different things we can do to improve your attention time by maybe not storing the stuff we don't care about, right? So sort of another level of filtering, if you will. Security settings, so that's all the stuff security officer can do, like control of how the accounts happen, how people log into the system, but also the super duper important things like SSL decryption, the confidentiality policies, and things like that, okay? And system info and licenses, that lovely page we always ask you to go to, which a lot of lovely information on that. Traffic stats, of course, on the collector, so we can show you the health of that traffic and whether it's sane or whether we need to improve things. Device updates, of course, backups, APIs, the usual. We'll do as much as we can, okay? Oh, Christ, there's even more. Okay, so all that stuff, reference list and blah, blah, blah. We'll do our best. The great thing about the slideshow, of course, is that it's not just a presentation tool. It's also kind of a hybrid with a reference material, so you can actually read all that stuff I won't have time to tell you about, okay? So there's questions at the end. If I say anything at any point in time that you need more information on, please stop me, interrupt me, and we'll do our best to answer. If it's super duper complex, we'll take it offline maybe later, okay? So the inclusion-exclusion policies, that's how we basically tell the system, well, this is the traffic I want, and that's the traffic I don't, right? There's 4 sections, and those fall into 2 overall categories, and it's pretty simple. Well, we have simple and complex, right? We call it simple because for the simple stuff, it's all based on IPs. We don't need to read into the HTTP information. We can just say, oh, that packet's got this, you know, this source IP and this destination IP, and based on that, we can filter all that stuff out. The great thing about that is that we don't actually, like I said, have to grep into that. So if the material is SSL encrypted, we don't need to decrypt it first before we say, oh, I don't want that, right? So we want to try and do it at the simple level as much as possible, much less overhead, less resources wasted, yada, yada, right? If though there's stuff that we want to filter out that goes beyond just looking at IPs and so on, we can use complex stuff, right? So that involves host names. So let's say if you have a bunch of, you know, you got name-based virtual hosting happening, and on this VIP you want potato.bmc.com, but you don't want fish. We can actually do it by host name, and we can even go with the advanced stuff. We can go really super complex filters. So, you know, I don't want any bots or blah, 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 that sort of thing. It's not rocket science. There you go. Okay, so when we're looking at the traffic, of course, it depends on where we're sitting on the wire, right? Because we know that there may be things in the network that could do some natting or changing of IPs or so on. So it's important to know what IPs we're actually looking for, right? If we're busy trying to exclude a bunch of server IPs and we never see those because we're in front of the load balancer, well, that's not going to work, right? So we can use the reference list to show us what server IPs am I seeing, what client IPs, and then, plan things accordingly, okay? All right, so I think this class, this involves a lot of jumping back and forth. So let me find the Firefox. Let me not look at Facebook and put it on collector, right? So in the virtual model, right, we have the analyzer and collector. And the collector is pretty much the one right down in the trenches, if you will, and it's really the one right down there, grabbing the enemy dog tags and all that stuff. Whereas the analyzer's job, it never gets its hands dirty, right? It lives up on the hill and just tells us the overall story. So that's why anything involves who we looking at, who we not looking at, what are we extracting, and so on. Most of that's all at the collector level. So let's look at the data flow settings, right? So we're all underneath the admin tab today, and we're going to go in traffic inclusion exclusion policies. Unfortunately, this is a demo system and I have crap examples here, but there you have it, right? So we have the client, the server IP. So these are all kind of viewed the same, right? So just by IPs, if we see this IP, we're going to, ignore it. We're going to capture this. So you may notice that number 1 there, right? The reason why there is a number 1 there, and if there was more, they'd have other numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on, is because there's a prioritization to these rules, and this gives us a certain amount of power, all right? Let's say, hi there, who just joined? Hello?
Hi, this is Prakash.
Okay, well, yep, we haven't gotten in too deep yet, so you're still okay. So we're just looking at the inclusion-exclusion rules, right? Okay, so back to my priorities, right? So let's say that our default rule was, to capture everything, right? But let's say there was a certain subnet we didn't want to capture, so we might say, okay, well, IP with mask this. Let's ignore that, right? But what happens if within that subnet there happens to be one IP we want to keep? Well, we would need to make a rule to capture that IP and make sure it's above the one where we're excluding the subnet, because we're going to use the highest priority rule that we match, right? So if I match that IP, hey, I keep it. If I have it below the one for ignoring the subnet, well, I've already ignored it. It's gone. It's not there, right? So that's the importance of those prioritization, because it helps us avoid having to have like individual, rules for each and every single one, because we can start using things like, subnets and masks and all that fun stuff, right? So as you can see, we've got, a default rule. So anything else that's not implicitly defined, we can put either capture all or ignore all, right? So there's 2 ways of doing that, right? We can either say, ooh, I definitely want to capture this, that, and the other guy, and we're going to ignore everything else. So that's is that the closed fist? Yeah, it's the closed fist. Or we can say the open palm, where I say I'm going to capture everything except for this, that, and the other guy, right? So we'd have some ignores, and then we'd have a capture all, right? I think I got that right. Whatever, anyway. Does anyone have any problems or questions with the inclusion-exclusion rules, or is it pretty simple? No questions? Okay. And notice how we can also, for the server, yep, go ahead.
Yeah, these exclusion and inclusion rules need to be placed on the collector or the main server.
Oh, you missed that bit. This is all the collector, right? Because the analyzer doesn't care about what IPs or anything like that. I mean, it records them, obviously, but it's not right down on the wire, right? The analyzer is up on the hill, and it's the collector's job to really control what it is we're looking at, right? And the collector's job is to take all those packets we see, build them into these hits, right? These request-response pairs, and then the analyzer goes and grabs all these and then figures out how to lump them into sessions and pages and so on, right? But all that nitty-gritty right at the front door stuff, it's all at the collector interface, right? It's the collector that has the capture interfaces on it. That's where the traffic actually is coming in. So this is as low down to the wire as we can get, okay?
Okay.
All right. Yeah, and notice how we can also use like ports as well, right? So maybe, there's one IP that we want, we want 443, but let's ignore port 80. We can do that if we want, right? And these advanced includes, I don't really have an example here, but it can be just about anything, right? Like, I don't know, user agent string contains bot, right? We ignore that. So that's pretty much where that goes. But like I said, it's pretty simple. Or at least the idea is simple, right? If it gets any more complex, well, you can always open up a ticket and we'll help you with that. Okay, so go back to Mr. Slideshow, and here we are. Okay, so Object type detection, all right? So once, as I've just said, we've lumped these request response pairs together and created these hits, if you will. Next, we need to figure out how we're going to consider these objects, right? Because that's going to affect how we build pages and other things as well, right? So most pages will have at least one container object, right? So like an HTML or a post or whatever, right? And possibly some components, right? Like images, CSS files, JavaScript, yada, yada, and maybe some redirects, right? Because maybe before we got to the actual landing page, the person tried to go to index.html, and the app said, no, 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 you must go over to index.php. So the landing object or the container object would be the index.php, and the first redirect object would be index.html, okay? So that's what redirects are all about. Back in the day, we couldn't actually modify that because these rules are pretty much using the file extension and MIME types and things like that, but now we can actually change that, right? So if your application behaves in a slightly different way than most other people's do, we can actually change the rules to make sure we can encompass that idea, okay? Now, beyond our containers and components, right, we also have documents, and that's going to be things that don't usually live within the framework of a quote-unquote page, things like PDFs and spreadsheets and Word docs and whatever, right? But just to give you an idea, if you wanted to, you could actually change those rules again, right? Let's say, for example, and I actually had a customer who did this, in their case, they wanted to measure how long it took, the transaction, from when the user did a post, right, and while the server is creating what was asked for, there's some little images, we're working on it, boom, last thing is a PDF, right? So in that particular case, that very specific PDF was considered a component, so it was tied in to that first container object. Sound cool? Okay, so in addition to all the usual 5 up there, or 4, whatever, we can also set a default rule, right? So if something comes along and it doesn't seem to match any of my other rules, we can tell the system what to consider that, right? By default, that's going to be container, but we can always change that if we wanted to, right? The neat thing is because you may possibly be looking at more than one application, we can actually have different rule sets, right? So in this application, well, these are considered one thing, and the other one they're considered another thing, and so on, right? So it's pretty cool. So all of that, of course, is going to happen on the analyzer. The only thing that doesn't exist in the analyzer on this page is the HTTP transaction timeout. That, of course, is going to be on the collector, whose job it is to build those hits, right? So that's where we set the transaction timeout. That's where, how long are we going to wait if we're not hearing anything before we give up, right? Like how long, you know, if the bus doesn't show up, are you going to go back and just drive to work, right? So that's it there. Now, the default industry, the industry default is 30 seconds. You could change it if you want to. You could bump it up if you will, but we don't necessarily, hi there, we don't necessarily want to be waiting forever for something that's not going to show up, right? Because keep in mind, all these things we're building, right? The sessions, the pages, the whatevers, we're having to, they're like jigsaw puzzles that we're building on a table, right? So if we have a bunch of pieces for a puzzle we'll never get the end to, how long do we want to leave that stuff on the table before we say, let's get rid of it, make room for more puzzles, if you will, okay? So that's the object type detection, the HTTP transaction timeout. So now, obviously, in order to build those pages, right, that have a container object and a bunch of components and blah, 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 obviously we're going to need to sessionize that somehow, right? And a session is really just a group of hits related to one user hitting the application and doing stuff, right? So the way in which we do that is we're going to attempt to find some sort of tag that's going to mean each and every single request of a given session, and also hopefully unique to that session, right? Because you know, we don't want to be lumping multiple people together, and we want to make sure stuff doesn't get split out into multiple sessions, right? So if we don't have a cookie or a path parameter or a post parameter or something we pull out using a custom field out of the body of the request or something like that, we wind up doing it by client IP, which can be okay if most of your people are like individual IPs and that's all cool. But let's say everyone from my office, like 30 people or whatever, were to hit your application and you lumped us all by client IP because, you know, from the outside it looks like it's all one IP, then that gets very confusing, right? How do we determine whose session it is, right? We're going to grab the first set of credentials we see, oh, it's John's session, so, but maybe it's not, maybe it's everyone's session, right? Then how do we go about building pages, right? Because if we're not sessionizing correctly and we're lumping everyone together, the way it works is if we see an object and say, aha, you are a component, what is your refer? Oh, my refer is index.html. We're going to go look to see if we can find a container object with that name within the same session and also within the page timeout value, right? And if we do, with a fair degree of certainty, we can say, aha, that component belongs with that container. But if it's all lumped together, how do we know that my picture of a squirrel goes with my index.html, not my coworker Alex's, right? It makes it more difficult, right? So that's why this is super duper important, not just for when we're going through the raw database to look through the session browser and whatnot, but if we're going to attempt to build pages and then apply meaningful thresholds to them, we got to make sure it's done right. Okay, and as with the other rules and so on, we can have different rules. Well, not for sessionization, but at least for termination, we can have different rules as to how we terminate sessions, right? Because how do we terminate sessions, right? It could be based on inactivity, right? Someone walks away from their desk, and okay, well, that session's obviously done, or max amount of time, right? So what we want to do with those termination rules is we want to mimic the way your application works as much as possible, right? I had an old, well, back in the day we called it a little TrueState box looking at our old CRM, and the CRM after half an hour of not doing anything, it kicks you out, right? Or maybe it's an hour, right? So that's a good limit to put that at, right? Because if I set it to just 30 minutes in EUEM, but it's an hour on my actual application, if I go there and I leave and go eat a sandwich for 40 minutes and I come back and do stuff, your application thinks, oh, that person's still working, whereas we say, oh, that ship has sailed, here's a new session, but they never log in again, so we don't know who it was, and so on and so forth. So we don't want to split up sessions. We don't want to, artificially break things. The last thing we can do, or actually there's two more things, we can also do it by max number of objects, because maybe there's certain traffic is not generated by human beings. And if it's not generated by human beings, it won't behave as humans do. And in theory, you just get all lumped in together, right? So we might want to cap it at a certain amount of objects, right? So what we do is we think of the max number of objects that a human could hit, right, based on what we see, and then put a little bit of padding on that and say, okay, if it's more than 20,000 objects, that's done, right? Because we don't want to have giant infinity session. We want to have manageable chunks of data that we can look through. Okay. The last one is we can actually have it by an event, right? So if I see log off or log out.html, I'll wait 0 seconds. And I'll terminate that sucker, right? But how many people actually log out? They're just going to click the little X, right? So we just have to do it. Well, we didn't see them, so there you go. Okay, so the way the tagging works, that can either be done it is done, but we can either see it either at the session level, where we're going to see, oh, we use the JSP or the ASP.NET cookie or whatever, right? So we use that. But at the actual object level, we can actually see the value. And what is the important thing to take away from this? Is that these values can change, right? Let's say we go hit the application for the first time. And the application says, oh, you're new. Here, have a cookie. Okay, cool. So I got my cookie. So every subsequent request will have that cookie on it. And then I do something exotic, like I log in, right? So the application might say, I'll see your original value, and I'll raise you this new value, right? So every subsequent request after that would have the new value, right? As long as we see the object in which we see the original cookie value and the new set cookie value, we can stitch it all together. Isn't that cool? It's lots of fun. Okay, and we can do even more complex stuff based on other things and tie in other keys and so on, but it can get pretty involved depending on how your application is set up. Okay, so page detection, right? When we talk about a page or this collection of objects that we have, it's stats. The page record can have the values taken either from the first hit that we see or the first container, right? In my example before, where we go and try and hit index.html, but we get redirected to index.php, or let's say potato.php, right? If I did page name based on the first hit, it would be index. If I did it on the first container, it would be potato, right? Okay. All right, so page timeout, again, as with sessions, well, we have other methods, but with pages, the only thing we really have to determine that was the end of the page is we didn't see anything after the last object we saw after a certain amount of time, right? So that is, I believe it's 30 seconds or whatever it was for that. So the page timeout is something we can set, right? But this is something we want to be really careful about because we want to make sure that we grab everything that belongs on that page, but not include things that maybe shouldn't be on that page, right? Like, let's say I crank that sucker out to a minute, right? So let the user, types in, monkey dot, index or whatever, and they get that page. They're going to see all the images and the JavaScripts and the CSSs and so on. And then they're busy reading, and then maybe they move their mouse, and suddenly there's a rollover image, right? So suddenly we have a call for a new image, its parent object is, the monkey, whatever, and because it fell within that minute, we say, oh, that must be part of the loading of the page. So suddenly our end-to-end time for the whole page goes up, even though there's a huge amount of idle time between those objects. So see, that's where I want people to be conscious and knowledgeable and really approach these things with open eyes to make sure they're doing it right. Because if we do it wrong, your numbers are going to be skewy. Any questions about this so far? Anyone completely overwhelmed? Are we all good? We're good? Okay, cool. So let's continue. All right, so all that fun stuff. So now we're going to share my analyzer, because that's where that is. All right, so let's go to, it's hidden behind that. Oh, come on. Yeah. Okay, so are you all able to see my my browser? Hopefully. Yes. Okay, good. So under Administration tab, so because we're talking about how data is handled, how it's grouped together and so on, all that stuff, of course, lives under Administration Data Flow Settings, right? So let's go look at, let's start with Object Type Detection first, because it's pretty simple, right? So like I said, right, it's pretty much just using the extensions or the MIME types to try and figure out what these things are, and so we can group them together into pages if they are components and containers and redirects and so on, or not, right? Where's the page timeout value, right? So that's so under page detection, of course, we have both the page timeout value, right, which is, apparently 15 seconds, yeah, 30 is a bit high. So we have the page timeout value, and we can also have the source of the attributes, right, either first hit or, or we can change it to something else if we wanted to, right? And, page termination, that's interesting. Oh, right, that's some super duper fancy stuff that involves some beacons and events and so on, but you could do a page termination if you had that, but that's a little bit advanced. Okay, so let's now go to session detection because it is quite, well, logically it's not that complicated, but it can be pretty complicated, and I'll get to there in a second. So the first thing we see is the sessionization status. So we can see how much of our traffic is actually being able to be grouped together, hopefully correctly, by the sessionization rules we have in place. And we're going to have all the stuff that we couldn't because we didn't find the tag, or maybe there was conflict, right, as we can see down here. If I have two sessionization rules, you should use this cookie, you should use that cookie. If I get a value for each of those cookies, which one do I use? I don't know. So we do it by IP. That's the way that falls out. So not terribly pretty, but sometimes it's the best we can do. And we want to try and make this area here, the gray area, as big as we can. There's a green area, which you don't actually see because there's no traffic that's following that, and that is the forced sessionization, right? So let's say there's traffic that we know is not human beings, so there's no point looking for cookies and blah, blah, blah. So we're just going to, anything that matches the filter we create is just going to be grouped together by client IP, and hopefully that's something that actually makes sense to do. Okay, down here we can see the cookies and other stuff we have in place, right? Now, default out of the box, I believe there's 15 rules in place, right? But I can tell you right off the bat that all your apps are not going to be using all 15 of those, right? So the best thing to do is to go to your devs, or just know it, and find out, okay guys, how do we tie sessions together, right? What is the name of the cookie we need to use? Then we create a rule for that, right? You'll note that there's no sort of prioritization, hence why we fall into the land of conflicts, and there can't be, because this traffic is sort of mutually exclusive, right? If we have this app, that app, the other app, they're not. But so if we did want to have some sort of priority, because let's say as a person hits your one app, they might go to another app or another app. They might jump back and forth. So we need to figure out what mechanism we're going to use to tie all of that, hopefully, into one session, right? So we can do that if we wanted to, right? So the way in which we create an artificial, what's the word I'm looking for, priority, we can actually create filters to do so, right? So we might say, use the bamboo one, right? Then maybe for the Black Planet one, I know this doesn't make sense with this example, but whatever. Let's say we created a filter to say, okay, we'll use, this user session cookie, but only if you do not see the JSession ID or the CFID, right? So we can create filters to control which thing we'll use in which situation, right? So that's very important, okay? So we have the keys and so on right there, right? And okay, so logically it's not that hard a thing to do, but it can be very messy because we know in a lot of situations, people will use maybe a single sign-on cookie or something like that to figure out who this person is. Their Apache servers and their IS servers might just be spitting out JSession ID and ASP.NET cookies just because, right? So we need to make sure that we don't have any rules of, hey, let's use that thing, because it can conflict with the actual thing we want to use. Okay? All right, hopefully I haven't lost a new one so far. Okay, good. So then we've got the termination rules, and that's simply how do we tell when the thing's over, right? And notice that we can actually have different rule sets for different applications. So then we have these rules down below, and we can use any or none or some of these however we want, right? So luckily, it will actually show us, once we have these rules set up, how much of the traffic is actually being handled by that rule, depending on how we've set it up, right? We've set it up for an inactivity of 45 minutes, and it looks like 96% of our traffic is actually, that's what's solving the session, right, based on that rule, right? We might have other situations where, they keep on working, but eventually, maybe the application says, well, you've been here too long. Maybe you took over the person. We want to make sure, log in again, right? So if we log in again, that's a new session, right? So that's what the maximum's all about there. And we also have our maximum number of objects. Not a heck of a lot to see in that. So 1,500 doesn't seem like a lot. It depends on your actual application, right? If your application involves seeing, hundreds and hundreds of pictures of like parakeets or whatever, then probably that number should be higher. But we can figure that out logically and play with it and get to the right spot, right? Then we have the specific events, right? And here there's nothing defined, but we could say if this is seen, wait X and then kill it, right? And like I said, not everyone logs out, so we have to think about that. But for those who do, might as well use it instead of having to wait 45 minutes before we say that session is done, okay? Any questions about object type detection, page building, or sessionization at this point? Oh, God, I hate it when you're quiet. You probably all fell asleep. Okay, let's go back to the slideshow.
No, we're still awake.
Okay, good. Yeah. If you can just, like clear your throats occasionally.
Well, I have it muted while I'm doing that.
Oh, well, okay. Well, if you sneeze, by all means, please do mute it. But, whatever.
There you go.
Whatever noise Okay, so, right. So we've got, the whole geo thing, right? The first public IP. Well, it's pretty simple, right? We've got this. So hopefully, we have an exported4 header that happens, right? Now we know a lot of proxies and other things strip out some of the headers and makes life difficult for us. But as long as we actually have that exported4 chain, because we know which IPs are public, we go, ooh, that's the first public one. We can then map that to our geo and say, aha, that dude's in Milwaukee, they were coming in on AT&T, and so on and so forth. So we can do all that cool geo stuff, right? So the great thing about the geolocation database, all that mapping pretty much happens in RAM, which is great because it doesn't have to go look anywhere, it doesn't need to go poke anything. It just knows that that IP is from Montreal, Quebec, Canada, EUEM, whatever. So we can do all that, right? So, and in theory, every quarter or so we get a new one of these. As long as you have an active support contract with us, as with the firmware, you are entitled to have the latest and greatest geo that we have available. And it's very important to have the latest and greatest if you actually do a lot of stuff that involves geo, right? For example, at one point in time, I think AT&T became AT&T Global, right? So suddenly, we had to make sure that we had the latest database to give us that and make sure our watch points that were focused on these things were set up accordingly, okay? All right, so geo. Okay, blah, this, okay. All right, so in the session browser, we can actually see what that looks like, right? So we get a lot of information. So the whole point, again, if you've missed it, of having geolocation is to, let's say we do see a big spike in network latency or something like that, right, that's clearly outside of your environment. We want to know if it's just affecting one group of people or whether it's affecting everyone, right? If it's affecting one group of people, well, and you do look at the news and you say, oh, that ISP had troubles in that town, it's probably them, right? But if it's closer to home and everyone's affected equally, then maybe it's closer to you, right? So it's all about trying to guess where the problem is based on the information we have. And the more information we have, the more educated our guess is as to where the problem came from. I'm not even going to bother showing you. It looked just like this. Ta-da! Okay, cool. All right, so error detection rules. Now let's get to the nitty-gritty of how do we figure out that something's broken, right? Well, we do that by matching certain conditions for the rules we have in place, right? We have 26 predefined HTTP error rules. So what that means, most of those will be application errors, right? They might not be errors, it might be informational codes, but we'll get to that in a bit. So what that means is the application's actually up, it's actually responding, but instead of getting a 200 okay, we got something else, right? We got like, 404 or 500 or something like that, right? To tell you that the application's up, but it couldn't process what was asked for, and well, here's your answer, right? It's not the thing you asked for, but here's your answer, right? In addition to that, we also have 8 predefined timeout error rules, right? So that would indicate a more physical problem, right? So if the server's not even responding, well, that's, we need to send the network guys in, right? As opposed to the application ones, we can go bug the guys who coded the damn thing and say, well, why isn't that working? But if we have timeouts, then something else is happening, right? So that's going to be things like either we saw the request and saw no response, or maybe we saw some of the response, or maybe the server just hung up on us, or maybe one of the weird ones, we have a client error where we saw the start of the request, but we never saw the end, right? And there was no abort, which is kind of bizarre, right? I expect to see that more in long, sort of spindly posts that happen, right? Maybe whatever, but that's something that can happen, right? In addition to the predefined ones we have, we can also set up 100 custom error rules. Now, what is a custom error rule? Well, it's pretty much anything you define, right? You set up this condition. If we match the condition, then that error condition is met, and the count goes up by 1, right? Why would I want to do that? Let's say that in my application, or your application, if you go look for something and that thing isn't there, instead of shooting back a kind of ugly 404, we get back this lovely page with pictures and animations and whatever that says, we're sorry, the thing you're looking for couldn't be found, error code, blah, right? So from a TCP perspective, from an HTTP perspective, it looks okay. We got a 200 okay back, but you know it's an error, I know it's an error. So what we could do is create a primitive custom field to go and grep for that error code equals blah, and if that's seen, return a value of true, create a custom error rule to say if that equals true, that is an error, right? So it can get pretty neat, right? But again, you can define these as anything. Mind you, and I'm going to do this in a funny order here, we have actual errors, and actual errors usually indicate something that's actually broken and we need to go fix it, versus informational code, which means we saw something, but it's not something broken, right? For example, let's say we saw a bunch of forbiddens, or they were doing the wrong thing or whatever, right? So it's not necessarily broken, but it's good to know that, right? For example, let's say we saw a lot of, forbiddens, and we looked at it and said, ooh, it's all posts, and they're all trying to pass commands to your application. That's bad, right? But it's not the same as actually having our site is down and broken, right? So two different levels, right? The only ones that actually get counted when we look at the watchpoint summary page or the reports and so on are going to be the actual errors, but we can still see the info codes when we go and drill in via the session browser, okay? So we have 6 categories, not all of which are used out of the box. So I can tell you right now that network and content you probably won't see a heck of a lot of unless you actually go and push some of those error rules into those categories, right? The main ones you're going to see, the only client area you're going to see is the client timed out mid-request. We talked about that one. Servers, again, all those timeout ones or physical ones like the server, barfed or something, or just didn't give us back any response. Then we have the application ones, which is usually, again, an HTTP response of some kind other than 200 okay. And content, some people put 404s in content, whatever, or leave it in application. It's up to you, right? It's to give you more granularity to help you figure out what you're doing, right? And the custom we already talked about, okay? So if we wanted to, every time we see an error, we can actually have a alert, or well, not alert, but a thing that goes out, right? And it could be either an SNMP trap or an email. Now, mind you, there's no intelligence to that, right? It's just going to, like, imagine you had 404s alerting you every time we see a 404, and we know there's that white space.gif that we kind of deleted, but pages still kind of call to it. Every time someone goes out the door, bing bong, bing bong, bing bong, you'd go mad. So if you are going to have anything coming out from this particular level and not the AIM, we recommend probably have that sent to some sort of machine or other device. Okay, oh, it's my cell phone. So some other device, like, let's say you got Nagios or some BMC thing or whatever. That's not my phone, that's weird. And then you could do that, right? So the machine would parse that instead of a human going insane because they're getting too many of these things, right? That's why we look at the AIM rules, because that's looking at percentage of errors. So let's say there's a certain amount of errors that we always see, but if we see suddenly like 5 times that, that's unusual. We want to know, okay? So I'm giving you like a little teasers about AIM. Okay, so so we can have them as info, right? So that's info things. So this is very interesting. This page is actually taken from the museum, because back in the 10 years ago, we actually considered 404s that had no refer or from outside. We were just considering those info codes, right? Now that makes a certain amount of sense, because if I go to bmc.com/monkey and the monkey doesn't exist, I'm going to get a 404, right? So I typed in something that doesn't exist. It's not necessarily broken, but but now, since people have different partners and so on, people calling to them and they want to make sure they're up. If they, they want to know when it happens, right? So if their partner is linking to them and hitting 404s, right, say outside of the domain and so on, then we're going to count it as an error. So most of these are all errors now, so that's kind of fun. So this is the way it works, right? It's just a filter, right? So HTTP status is 404, URL host is URL host, and refer host, and that's the way that works, right? So there's different, filter expressions we can use to define these, and we can either have it stop or keep going, right? You'll notice most of these will have arrows going down, but I can tell you, when you get down to server not responding, we stop, because if the server is not responding, you're not going to see any more error codes, right? So that's something to consider, right? We can choose which category we want it, whether it's an error or an info code, and whether or not we send an alert, if you wanted to do it that way, like I said, but I wouldn't. Okay, and in the session browser, when we go get that big pile of sessions, the big haystack, if you will, you're going to see your errors, and you're going to see them highlighted with the numbers and so on, right? Notice the info codes, the green things, are kind of squishy and nothing there, but if I was more interested in the info codes, I could click that, all the reds would squish down, and I'd see, 1, 3, 4, whatever. So that's the way that works. Okay? Right, so this is only showing real errors, and that, again, is from the, I need to update this slide. It's from the museum. Okay. So here we have our errors by category, and we did go over this in the basic nav. So as you can see, it's just a way, once we know we have errors, we want to know what type of errors we see. Is it basically stuff timing out, or is it stuff where the application is kind of wigging on what was asked for? Okay? All right, error rules. Does anyone have any questions about error rules? Do we want to go look at error rules? Do we care about error rules? Anyone? If not,
this is Charlie, not particularly, but I don't speak for everybody.
Well, if no one else does anything, we're going to carry on. So, is anyone pretty comfortable with the idea of how these error conditions work? Right, it's pretty simple, right? Just categories and just to give us more granularity. Yeah.
Yeah, can you just explain those rules actually, because in our environment there are a lot of rules set up, and I just wanted to see.
Okay, yeah. Well, I can tell you right now that most people don't go bother doing their own or mucking around with them, but I'll just show them anyway. So let's go. So of course this is again on the analyzer, because we're now analyzing data we see, like what's errored, what's slow, what's what. So that's going to be, so anytime we're talking about thresholds and all that sort of stuff, it's going to be under administration, thresholds, and problem detection. So it's going to be right up here, the first one. So here's our error rules, right? Remember, like I said, right, 404s, ooh, they're all errors now, right? So the way they work is it's pretty simple, right? One of my favorites, and I'll just show you it just because it's kind of cool, is server, where is it? Server too busy to respond. What the heck does that mean, right? We don't know. Let's go have a look. What it means is we're mid-request, so basically you call it the pizza joint and like a large blah, 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 and then there's no response back, right? The other side didn't say nothing, and they hang up, right? Is denied means a TCP reset, so it's like, blah, blah, click. So that's essentially, it's trying to tell us when the server is basically just hanging up on people, right? So it's kind of neat. So we can choose which category we want it in, and we can also choose whether we're going to, so in this case, again, since it's too busy, we're just going to stop right there. So if we go back to my view all, you're going to see most of these guys at the top. We sort of go through, because it's possible we might hear more than one, right? Maybe the length required was wrong, but there were also, unsupported media type, right? So go here, here, here. But if there's ones here, the ones with the stop means there's no point looking any further, right? Once my server's aborted my request, well, the buck stops there, okay? All right, any questions on this?
Yeah, just one.
Sorry, go ahead.
These be done by, like, source IP address or watch point or something?
Oh, well, watch points, well, because keep in mind, watch points might be outside of that realm, right? Like, errors are going to be at the object level, right? I asked for the thing, whether it's whitespace.gif or the whatever, right? And then I'm either going to get the 200 OK and here's your thing, or I'm going to get something else, right? So you might not be able to do it by watch point per se. You could probably, if it's an object level watch point, you might be able to reproduce those filters, right? I've seen ones as silly as, user ID is equal to John, right, or whatever, right? So I probably wouldn't count that a real error, but at least an info code, right? So you can know when John logged in if you wanted to do that sort of thing.
404s, and we maybe want to consider them informational, but the
absolutely.
client 404 is really important, and we want to consider that an error. So I didn't know if you could differentiate that way.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, right. So if we go into, the way to do that. I think I just edit it here. So if we edit my no refer, is that the right one? Yeah. So if I said, well, you know what, it's not really an error because people can type anything in the bloody URL, right? So we could put it on informational right there, right? So we can modify these things as much as we want, right? Now, it's like even with the custom fields, right? Even the system custom fields, the ones we absolutely need to have them work, you can completely break them if you want to, right? I mean, I don't know what you want to, but I mean, you can change the way they work to meet your needs, right? Because what you want this system to do is to tell you a story, right? So you want to make sure that it understands the stuff the same way you understand the stuff and the same way you want to group things together, right? Even a page, I mean, servers and stuff don't think about pages. They just know here's all the stuff, right? But we know it's a page because that's the way we see it as a human being, right?
Right.
So same thing here. So we can do that. So we can change the severity if you want. We can change the category. So let's say, like I said, a lot of people might consider 404s instead of just being, application. We might want a bit more granularity, and maybe I might want to say that 404 rule is actually a content error, right?
Right,
so,
but if I want to do this just for, say, one client, is that where I'd use the filter expression?
Well, if you wanted to use one client, here's where it gets a bit weird because we can't, okay, so let me, that was right there, damn it. So notice here how we can edit it, but we can't actually change the filter, right?
Right.
So what we'd need to do there is you probably have to create a custom error rule that exactly mimics the 404 rule,
okay,
and add a filter there for that client and make sure that rule is above, right? So that's one way you could do it, right?
Gotcha.
So you could, there's so many ways to skin a cat, right? So we can easily create things that supersede the other rules, right? So let's say for most of our 404s, we just want them to, well, not all of them, but all the ones outside of your domain, we could say they're informational. But if it's from this one dude, then yeah, that's a real error. We just put it above, right? So that's a great thing about the prioritization and the numbering system. Okay? Are we cool? Are we good?
Yep.
We happy? Okay, sweet. No, someone just dropped off, so maybe I scared someone away. That happens. Okay, so error rules. Okay, so custom fields, right? So just about every field of data. So if I were to go and export my raw data, whether I'm looking at the page or the object or session level, right, all the rows, if you will, are going to be the records, right? So this record, that record, the other record, and all of my columns will be my custom fields, right? So I'm going to have one for, let's say, client IP, server IP, URI stem, cookie, whatever. So that's what all those are, right? So we have them at the different levels, obviously, because we look at the data at different levels, right? So we have our object, dir, page, and session, right? Now, what's this primitive thing all about, right? Well, primitive custom field, the idea behind there is because, let's say we want to know which browser it was at the, the object level or the page level or the session level. Well, it shouldn't change in between, but there you have it. But so instead of having to, but you still want to know, right, at the different levels. So instead of having to recreate that same rule at all those levels, it might make more sense to have something done much more lower level. So at the actual hit level, we say, okay, what was your browser? What was your OS? And record it there. And then we can do is we can reference it at the other levels, right? So at the session, I could say, show me the first value you saw for, I don't know, URI host or whatever. We could do that, right? The other thing about the primitives, it's the only place where we can actually do content extraction, right? So if we go, and of course this is all done on the collector, so at that level we can actually go through the actual headers or even the body of the requests and the responses and say, okay, let's extract everything from, and then we're going to grab it all the way till something else, and we can do some transformations on that. So we can do all that fun stuff. These numbers I think have bumped up a little bit. We can probably modify them if you want, but that's pretty much what we're playing at. So 10 per each of these levels and 30 primitive custom fields, right? And that can be on anything we capture, right? So it can be post parameters, cookie parameters, headers, the body, whatever is actually in the form of HTTP information, we can pull out and we can feed a custom field. And the whole point of doing that is to allow us to localize on things, right? We can use it to define watch points. We can use it when we're doing queries to say, well, show us all the things that had this value of that thing, and it will be that value of that thing. And we can see if the problem is there or elsewhere or whatever. So it's all about localizing. That's the whole point, right? So one of the great things is even though we pull out information, just because it's long string of gobbledygook doesn't mean that's our answer. We can apply mappings and transformations to that data. We can do things like trim out the white spaces, replace this for that, cut out this bit. We can do all that, and we can even do string mappings, right? So we could say, if you see, H5264, that equates to, giraffe, right? We can do that. We'll show that in a bit. Okay, so we can see that just about anywhere, right? Like I said, we can see it in Excel. If we pull out that CSV, go look at Excel, there it is. And we can also look at it when we're using the session browser. We can actually look at the custom fields at the different levels that we saw, right? And we can use it for all kinds of things, right? Remember I mentioned the Boolean custom field, looking for the presence of error code, blah. Well, we can use that to define our error conditions. We can even track sessions based on that, right? Maybe every request in there, in the body of it says, whatever. We can use, and if that's unique to that session, we can use that, right? And we can even, when we export it in APIs, like I said, we can view that externally, okay? All right, okay, so that's our custom fields. Oh, cool, so we're going to look at how we actually make them. This is great. Okay, so let's say we're creating a custom field. This is an object field, I know, because it's got the little block object, right? So we need a field name, of course. What are we calling that thing, right? Hair color, okay? We're going to have a description if we want. Then we're going to have a grammar name and an export name. The export name will be what that column of data is called in, if we look at it in Excel or whatever, right? It's going to be X custom plan ID. For the grammar, if I want to use that as part of my filter expressions and so on, it would be the grammar name that comes into place. In this case, custom plan ID. Okay. Expected data type can be strings, it can be integers, it can be booleans, it can be decimals, whatever you want to play with, right? Well, not whatever, but our nice little list of stuff. Okay. So once we defined a custom field, let's say we're talking about hair color, right? We're going to need different rules to determine what people's hair color is, right? So let's talk about extraction rules, right? The reason I'm using hair color is, let's say we're talking about someone who has no hair on their head, right? Might need to look somewhere else, like their eyebrows or whatever. I won't go any further south with that example, but you get the idea, right? So when we create an extraction rule within a custom field, we can have multiple ones, right? Because we have, let's say for browser, we're going to have a rule to handle IE versus Firefox and whatever. We need to create an extraction rule. So the first thing to do in the extraction rule is, of course, to figure out, well, what traffic does this particular rule apply to, right? Now, if it's at the bottom of the list, it's a default catch-all, right? So anything that wasn't implicitly matched by filter above, this is the rule we're going to use, right? But we could say, we could either define it by an expression, right? Like your iHost is equal to blah, or we could even use what we call extraction field domains, where we can actually set up these different domains based on their iHost and IPs and whatever. And so we can reuse without having to recreate that filter, right? So we can do that, or a combination of. So once we figure out what traffic we're looking at or where we're looking at, then we figure out, all right, what's the thing we're actually going to look at to give us the value, right? So that could be something like a post parameter or a cookie or whatever, right? So it's going to be key, and we can pick what that key is, right? So that's the way that works. We're going to pick whatever it is. Mind you, the data source doesn't actually have to be something that's in the traffic, right? I might have a filter or a rule. Let's have a rule for bots, right? In that case, my filter might be anything that's got bot in the user agent string, and instead of actually pulling anything out, I can just return a fixed string, and I can say bot or robot or something, right? So that's the cool thing. We don't need to waste a lot of time pulling things out. If we know if it matches that filter, it's a, right? So that's a strength there. Okay, once I've actually pulled out that value, it's going to give me something, right? So I can apply transformations to that, and that, like I said, that could be anything from like white space trimming to, capitalization or whatever you want to do, or like this, string mapping, right? And the string mappings are kind of neat because, first of all, we can do hundreds and hundreds, I think like 1,000 per string mapping. But we can control how this behaves, right? We can say, so if it's one of these values, it's going to map to these things, right? If it's not one of these things, we have to go by the default rule, right? The default rule might be, we could return a fixed string of, say, unknown, or we might say just use the original value. So if it's like, so we'll just return, so that's what that's all about there, okay? So once we've done that, like I said, there's our X custom plan ID with all the values, right? So for all this stuff, we know that that's the health plan, that's the employee benefits, or however the heck you want to do it, right? Could be anything, right? And it shows up in the session browser as well. Look, they go down here. Okay, so see like browser. All of these things are fields of data that we've populated, right? Now, some of them actually are custom fields, like ones that you can totally make from scratch, or they could be like our system ones, right? Like browser and OS and all that stuff. That's stuff that we need. You can't delete them or turn them off, but you can at least modify them and change the rules. And you probably will need to do that as we go into the future. And there are more browsers to consider and more OSs and things like that. Okay, so let's go play. Any questions? Are we happy? Okay. Well, the giggle, I'll take that as a yes. Okay. So let's, oh, that's even better. You know what? Let's not look at the analyzer right now. Well, okay, maybe we should. So things like user ID, for example, right? So like I said, we can have a whole bunch of different rules, right? If I'm looking at this, that, and the other application, maybe how those people are identified might be very different ways. So we need to make sure we have rules to to capture that, right? But notice here that instead of having to say, okay, this app, that app, the other app, oh, in this case we said just docs, right? But for the rest of them, what we can do is we can have a prioritized list of rules, right? So if I happen to see basic authentication credentials, let's use that, right? So the thing about this is that we're going to try and use the highest rule we can, right? So maybe a session starts, but they haven't logged in yet, so we don't know who they are, right? So until that point, we'd have to use the highest one we have, which is maybe client IP. So so if you run a session browser query and you notice you got a bunch of names and maybe some IPs in there, that's essentially what's going on. But the second they log in, we're going to revise our session record with the new higher priority value, right? So if we saw that there was a post parameter with the username, we're going to grab that value, and suddenly it's Joe Smith. Cool, huh? Okay, so that's pretty. I like this one because this one's a bit more of a sequential, prioritized list of rules. That's pretty neat. But for the cool ones, let's go look at some of those primitive custom fields on the collector. Right. So if we go over here, custom fields. Notice they're all little round circles because, well, they're primitives and it's the only ones that exist here. Because again, collectors have no idea what pages are in sessions and all that stuff. They just know the hits, right? So if we go look at browser name, for example, notice that we've got all these different rules because maybe, well, yes, definitely, how those browsers get represented in the, say, user agent string might be very different as how other ones might be. So we have to make sure that we are using a meaningful way of pulling out information so we know which browser it is, right? So notice that these are kind of mutually exclusive because, if it's Internet Explorer, it's not going to be Safari, right? Yeah, so most of these are using the user agent string, which is this big, like I said, long string of gobbledygook with information in it, and we can pull it out and do cool stuff. One thing that's really cool, let me show you this. If we look at OS, boom, user agent string 2. Yay, kind of cool. And over here, notice how if it's a robot, I don't care. I don't want to pull anything out. If you're a bot, I'm going to say robot. There you go. So let's look at my friends. Oh, that's kind of cool. MSIE 11. That's interesting. Because I know MSIE changed your user agent string a bit. Now it's all Trident something, but whatever. Anyway, so let's look at how Internet Explorer does things. Okay, so if we go and edit the rule. So obviously, your user agent string has to contain MSIE, Then for our source, we're going to use user agent, of course. And we're going to be doing some fun stuff. Now, regexes are fun. I think they're a little bit intellectual snobbery for both people and machines. It takes a bit more brains to work through it. But apparently, this regex expression will actually spit out something that looks like MSIE4, MSIE mobile, and so on and so forth. And then because MSIE 5 isn't English enough for us, we're going to actually use the string mapping to turn this into this, right? Well, there you have it. Let's look at Firefox, which I think is a bit more fun. So here, what we're going to do is we're going to extract everything, from Firefox, including the Firefox, and we're going to strip everything after the dot, right, including the dot. So we're going to have Firefox something. We're going to replace the slash with a colon, and we're going to put a .x on the end. So it'll be Firefox number and colon .x, right? So that's the way that works. It's kind of fun. What's another good one I'll show you? Okay, just very quickly back to the analyzer. Let's talk about page name, because that's a fun one. We want to know what the page is called, right? Because URI stem is fun, but it's all that, whatever. So let's figure out how we're going to name those pages, right? If we have, so apparently we have this weird, where the heck that is, but let's focus on the first one down here, right? So here we have a bunch of substring transformations to the entire URI stem. And do we remember what the URI stem is? I hope we do. So if we look at this URL up here, right, for this actual thing here, the host would be, well, the IP, right? Oops, that's not what I want to do. But okay, they would be the IP, and the stem would be everything it follows that. So the whole stem would be /admin/customfield.do. Going back to my thingy, if we look at that, so what do? We're going to extract everything after the last slash, right? One from end. So it's going to be the last slash. So that would be, in this case, more.do stuff. We're going to strip off everything that starts with the question mark, including the question mark, right? So all those query parameters. So data point, blah, 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 gone. So now we're left with more.do. Then we're going to strip off everything after a semicolon, which might be some sort of param. And we're also going to strip off everything after the dot, including the dot. So guess what this page is called? And we're going to convert it to lowercase. In this case, this would be the more page. Isn't that fun? So we can just use some very simple stuff like that. It's possible, however, you might need to get more exotic. Let's say there's a bunch of pages and the URI stem is all soap.aspx, right? In that case, maybe there's a query parameter we might need to grab to populate the page name custom field to know that's in, create a new shopping cart page, save page, modify my account, whatever. We can do that sort of thing. Any questions on custom fields whatsoever? Does everyone totally get this? If there's a test later, everyone will pass? I hope. Okay. Well, like I always say, I might not turn you into ninjas overnight, but at least you know where to go play and what to go play with to come back to us with the super cool question that's going to change the universe.
I did have one question.
Yes, please.
List of all the possible operatives somewhere, is that documented?
The list of all the what? Oh, yes. Yeah, guess what? In the PDF I'm going to give you of the slideshow presentation, there's all that fun stuff in the back of the PDF. So, see, we thought of everything. Well, most things anyway. Okay, let's go back to my presentation here. So that's custom fields. All right, so PCLs. Well, as we know, this is a bit more of a hippie-ish version of the SLT. The SLT is a very cold, hard thing. Are you slow? Are you not slow? Whereas this, we're saying, well, how are you feeling? Oh, I'm feeling good. I'm feeling okay, or I'm feeling angry. So the idea there, it's all about setting those two thresholds instead of just, the one. And unlike the SLT, which is very much a page-level metric, right? So we need a page hit with a page name, whatever, to give it an SLT. PCLs are more sort of watch point oriented, right? So maybe it doesn't have to be an actual page. It's just stuff that we're measuring. Chances are it will be a page, but you get the idea. Okay, so the main place that shows up is our map of the world GeoPCL dashlet. So you can see, ooh, is it green? Is it yellow? Is it red? Or we can run some performance compliance graphs to know, well, in terms of all our traffic, are more people happy than sad or whatever? We can do that too, okay? SLTs, it's very binary. Are you slower than this? Yes or no, right? Now, unlike the PCLs, which focus on a bunch of different metrics, the SLTs are pretty much limited to end-to-end time, which is the whole period of time for the transaction, or the host time, which is how long it took our application to spit up what was asked for, right? So when I go in there, ask for my Big Mac, my fry, and my Coke, as soon as that tray shows up, that's my host time, right? And you know that you are in complete control of host time, right? You can get better and better host time by writing more efficient code. You can get better servers, fatter pipes, more RAM, more CPU, all that fun stuff. So that's something you can be very aggressive about, right? Whereas the end-to-end, we know that includes network time. So maybe we shouldn't be as aggressive about that because we can't, because maybe there's certain parts of that transaction that are completely outside of our control, right? If the guy's using like a 386 on an analog modem, well, when you could even hit your site, I imagine that's probably not your fault, right? So that's what we want to allow for a little bit more overhead when we think about end-to-end time, right? There is also page render time. That's a fancy thing I'm not going to get into, but it involves snippets of JavaScript code that time things and then shoot back at a call for an invisible GIF. We take that information, tie it to the thing to figure out how long the page took to render. Now that obviously makes a lot of sense if you have content that's served from elsewhere that we don't actually see, right? We can only tell you the picture from what we see, right? So if there's stuff served elsewhere, we have to be made aware of that somehow, right? The most complete way of doing that, of course, would be the cloud visibility stuff from Akamai. So if you use Akamai, you can actually pay them for a service where they're going to shoot back receipts to your origin for what they served up, and we can stitch that into our session and page building model. Yeah, kind of fun. Okay. So the SLTs, so they can be based on actual page name, right? So the Catherine_is_cool.html page, well, it wouldn't be .html, but that page would have a certain value because I have lots of flashy GIFs and other stuff on my page. Then you could even have stuff by page name custom extraction, right? So remember how I showed you with the page name, we had the default and we had other whatever thing. So maybe those pages, they're just different, right? Maybe they have a lot of media on them or whatever versus the page that says hello. So we would put different speed limits, right? Because the page says hello, that one, it's not going to take time. So if it does take time, that's unusual. We want to flag that. Whereas the one that's got like 100 pages of sneakers, well, no one's expecting that in light speed, right? So we need to, again, have meaningful thresholds, okay? All right, and that's used just about everywhere, right? Anywhere we want to talk about slow, right? Whether we're talking about, percentage of slow traffic with the AIM rules, or we want to show you, performance dashlets and things like that. That's where the SLT comes into place, right? Any questions on this as I slowly but surely get over to the analyzer? Anyone care? Anyone awake? Everyone happy? Anything? Okay. Okay. Well, I'll show you a little bit. I'll show you where it's set up at least, okay? So on the analyzer, again, in the thresholds and problem detection, we can look at how, say, let's start with PCLs, how that is handled, right? So notice here how it's just 2 lines of thresholds, right? So 2 seconds for EE, 5 seconds frustrated, pretty much the same for most of them, right? Now it's important to note that these can actually be overridden at the watch point level, right? What happens if we make a watch point for those poor sods in Antarctica who are hitting your app in Boston? Well, they're probably not going to freak out if it takes a little bit longer, so we might have different thresholds to define when they're happy and sad and tolerating, right? So it makes a lot of sense to be able to override those for subsets of your traffic. Because remember, watch points don't just focus on bits of your application. They can also be used to focus on subsets of your user base as well. So that gets kind of cool. And where is it? Where's SLT? This, right? So we've got our page names. Now, this is interesting by specific watch point. That actually is, that's a fancy thing. That has to do with, what am I talking about? It's the application watch points from the APM consoles. If you have all that, you'd have this. But if you don't, you wouldn't really be able to use this area. It'd be all gray, right? So we have our specific page names, which we have not done. We have our different rules here. So this one's not defined, but we could have it for, this or the other one, or any page that we have not implicitly defined is going to take this much time, or it should take under that much time. However, they came up with 6 seconds and 102 milliseconds. I don't know, but anyway, that's what that is. Okay, any questions on this stuff for y'all? Y'all good? Everyone still there?
Yeah, can we send out email notification based on these SLTs and SLTs?
Can you send out a what?
Email notifications?
Well, what do you mean by email notification? This is just where we come to say whether or not these things happen. Now,
so if let's say in the second point, page SLT is a specific watch point, right? So one of these values does not match. Is host alive? Is for 5 seconds it will wait, and if it's not alive, it will send out an email notification, right?
Well, okay.
Or is it
the
not?
Only way it would send out an email notification is if we went to go and, let's say we created a custom error rule to say if it takes longer than this, we're going to send it an email, right? But that's we're not taking advantage of the intelligence of the system, right? What we would do is we would go where we're getting with the AIM rules. And what the AIM rules are looking at, we can create AIM rules for specific watch points. And what it's looking at is percentage of traffic that was considered slow, right? So we can make those rules very aggressive, so anytime we see it, it's going to create, oh, there was an incident, we saw slowness, right? And it's going to alert you about that and send out an email, right? But this is very far away from there. This is the bottom line. This is where we're saying, is it slow or is it not slow, right? This is literally putting up the speed limit sign, right? What we do with that afterwards, that's other stuff, right? But this is we're literally creating the speed limits for these different things, right? So that's what we're doing here.
Okay, got it. Yeah.
All righty, cool. Okay, so back to
I have one question for you.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just looking at the screen here. What is a page name extraction rule?
Aha. Well, remember how when we looked at the custom fields? Let's go very quickly over there. Where the heck am I going? Custom fields. Notice how I can have different rules for different types of traffic, right? Maybe it's for different, applications or whatever, but this is independent of how we're actually cooking up the name, right? It's possible, let's say I had one for, one type of page based on that we can define a certain way, and another for another type of page, right? So on the same application, and they might even use the exact same rules as to how they go about naming the page, but by virtue of having different rules for different types of pages, I can then apply speed limits to each of those types of pages, right?
Gotcha.
Yeah, so it's just another way. Instead of having to have hundreds of specific page names, we can just have it for, this group of pages should take this long, that group of pages should take that long, right? So it's just a mechanism to apply more intelligence to it, right?
You're just applying like a string pattern to...
Absolutely. Right?
Okay, I got you.
So, so we're sort of leveraging Because like I said, maybe you have multiple rules and they all use the same damn thing to figure out what the page name actually is, but by virtue of having defined with a filter, we can apply speed limits to the traffic that matches those filters, right? So I think it's kind of cool. Okay. Alrighty. Back to the thing. We're actually doing pretty good on time, I think. Okay. So let's talk about AIM. Everyone loves AIM because it does the work for you. Assuming we've actually built sessions and pages correctly and put up meaningful speed limits, then we can actually have the system look at your traffic over the last 4 weeks. And once it's established what normal is, tell us when stuff is not normal, right? So this is actually using, well, it's sort of a representation of the summary data. So, you know, all those numbers that we aggregate and so on, those different watch points. We're going to, well, not all those numbers, sorry. You know, it's whether it's slow or not slow and whether or not it's aired. We're going to basically aggregate that in 5-minute buckets, and so each of those is going to be, you know, sort of pointing there, and we're going to establish what the baseline is and also what the upper and lower boundaries, right? So essentially we're going to turn those last 4 weeks of traffic, which would be all these squiggly lines here, into this, right? So we've got our baseline, which is the one here, and we've got our upper and lower boundaries based on how much variance we saw, right? Let's say this is Tuesday, Tuesday's more crazy, and Wednesdays, everyone's normally pretty much the same. So on Tuesday, it would have to be that much wackier to be considered abnormal versus on a Wednesday where everyone's pretty much like clockwork, right? So that's the way of doing that. Now, that being said, it's good to know that, but one thing I've liked to do with my customers is to move away from defining incidents based on what we've seen in the past, right? Because because something's screwy every Thursday doesn't mean we should accept that as normal, right? So what might make more sense from trying to use this baseline is to still use it to determine how abnormal it was, but to maybe set a hard number, right? To say, you know what, if more than 20% of my traffic is aired or slow, that's considered an incident, right? So we're going to talk about that in a bit and how we actually create that. So this is kind of neat. The abnormality we talk about, what the heck is that, right? Well, it's this, 1 to 4. So it's a logarithmic scale. I always forget whether it's exponential or logarithmic, but it's using all those things there. So if the value that we saw, right, from the baseline is between the baseline and what we expected, well, its abnormality is 0 because we expected it, right? But if it's more than that, that's how this works, right? So if it's between, the max and twice the max, abnormality 1, 2, and 4 times 2. So if we're saying that it's abnormality 4, we're saying that what we saw was 16 times higher than what we've seen normally. So that's pretty serious, right? So that's how we go about setting the sensitivity of that, right? Without having to go and change SLTs and all that stuff, we can change how crazy does it have to be before I send an email to Patrick so he wakes up and goes and fixes the server, right? So that's essentially what that's all about, okay? So when we go and create these, what we're going to see is a table like this. We're going to see all of the watch points we've got in our system, all the active watch points, and we're going to see how many rules we have for each of these things, for each of these watch points. Now, I'll tell you right now, we can only have one performance rule per watch point, whereas availability rules, you can actually have more, specifically for the all objects, because availability rules can focus either on all the errors or maybe just some of the errors or maybe some of the other errors, right? So depending on which rule we saw flagged, we'd know, oh, it's that error versus that error, right? So that sort of thing. So we can then go and create one. So let's do that. So first thing we need to do is we need to come up with a name for it. We're going to pick a watch point, right? So maybe it might be all pages, might be something else. Then we can choose what type we want, right? So I've been pretty much focusing just on availability, whether it's aired or performance, which is, performance of slow or performance of aired. There's also volume, right? So maybe you want to know if, oh, we did that email marketing campaign, suddenly our traffic, quadrupled or whatever, right? So we can do that. If we choose availability, we can choose which areas we want, right? We can say all or just the ones down here, right? Like I said. Once we've done that, the next step is to determine what makes it an incident. Well, these conditions do. So the first thing to determine is when are we going to look for abnormal, right? You'd probably just say, well, it's going to have at least this much traffic and it's going to be at least this aired, right? Because if it's less than that, like either we're in a maintenance period or whatever, then, we're not going to freak out because we saw, these errors. Right? Mind you, one that's important to click all the time is, let's say we're looking at volume. You might want us to click all the time because let's say the traffic drops below the minimum expected or it goes down to 0 or stuff. I want to know about that. You want to know about that. So it doesn't make sense to only look for abnormal if we have at least this much traffic for volume-related signals, okay? Or rules, I should say, okay? Next up, how do we consider it abnormal? 2 different ways. One, X standard deviation from the baseline. So it's a standard, what is it, the square root of the variance or some crazy thing like that. So again, that's okay, but again, I don't think, precedence actually makes something right. It's just there. So I'm a much bigger fan of actually, as an organization, saying, well, we can handle up to this much errors or this much slowness. And if it goes above that, we're going to consider that abnormal, right? Just because we see abnormality doesn't necessarily mean it's an incident, right? It has to have other things as well. Well, the first thing, obviously, is how long did it last, right? We know that we're dealing with 5-minute buckets, so the smallest amount I can have there is 5 minutes. So if it was out for at least 5 minutes, boom, that's an incident, right? Or I could use what I call the magical urgency rating. It's a number between 1 and 100, and obviously the higher the number, the more urgent it is, and it literally just calculates how long it's been open, how many users were affected, and how abnormal, right? So the more it is of all those three things, the higher that number is going to be. But I'm just a big fan of using time, okay? Next up, when do we terminate the incident, right? Because maybe we see madness, nothing, madness, nothing, madness, nothing. That, to me, sounds like it's probably all the same incident, just things happened within that kind of mess it up. So what we'd have to do is how long are we going to wait after it went back down to normal before we say, okay, now we're done, and anything after that would be another incident, okay? So it's just how do we differentiate between one gigantic incident and a bunch of little incidents, okay? All right, next up, once we know that we have, okay, so it's an incident, it was bad, it was this bad, we want to know who was there at the scene of the crime, right? In the old days, you could not choose these, right? But now we've made it much more flexible, so you can choose which localization factors you want. For example, if all your IPs are private IPs, geolocation probably doesn't make much sense. If you have, however, a custom field that's telling us a certain query parameter that might help us know what command was being done, that would help because we want to know, oh, look, there was more create shopping cart pages and they had more problems. So it's all about figuring out, okay, that was the problem, that was how bad it was. Who was there? Who could have committed this crime, right? As we know, though, that all web traffic has so many moving parts. Maybe it's a combination of factors, but at least we can figure out the patterns, right? It gives us stuff to play with and to test out to see whether or not these things are an issue, okay? All right, so that's the localization factors. Then, of course, we have notification, right? Just because it's an incident doesn't mean we're going to send out emails and freak everyone out. We have to meet other criteria as well. Maybe those criteria might be more higher than what we saw before, or we could just say if it's an incident, it is critical. We could just do something as simple as under the following conditions, and abnormality rating is 1, right? As soon as it pops out, if you're an incident, you're critical, right? Or, let's say instead of 5 minutes, we're going to wait, oh, well, if it's going for 10 minutes, now that's serious. Now people should wake up out of bed and go fix it, right? So we could say urgency rating like this, but guess what? These 3 factors down here are the 3 elements of the urgency rating, but independent, and you can use, all, none, or some of them if you want, okay? Once we've established that the incident is not just an incident, but a critical incident, we can then say, how do we get notified, right? We could send out an SNMP trap, which is great, shoots it off to some sort of BMC thing or Nagios or whatever you got going on, or we could send it out an email, right, to a notification group we already have defined, or an individual email address, right, pope@thevatican.vc, right? Now, simple network messaging protocol, right, it's got the word simple in it. That's because it is, right? The amount of details you get in the email will be more than you get in the SNMP, but hopefully the SNMP is because they're using us in combination with a bunch of other tools and stuff to give you a bigger picture of what's going on. So you don't need that level of human English, details as to what's going on, okay? All right, so AIM and SLTs. All right. Is this like of good value so far? Are you guys learning a lot?
Yep.
Okay.
Yes.
Good. Yeah. This is pretty much, I know we have all those other BMC products, but if you just had EUEM, to me, AIM is pretty much the culmination of all of that, right? Because once we've told the system exactly how to interpret all this stuff, this system by itself will monitor the traffic and tell you when stuff is weird instead of you looking at a report every week and going, aha, it changed this week, right? So here, the system will say, I saw madness, and this is the reason for the madness. So let's go to incident detection, right? So if we click on that, and eventually goes there. So there's all my list. Alex is in content. God, my coworkers make the craziest watch points. Anyway, so here's all my watch points, and there's all my rules, right? So it's pretty simple to make it up. If it looks like a speedometer, that's performance, right? If it looks like a little can, that's volume. If it looks like a little back and forth arrow, that's availability, right? Did the person get the thing they wanted or not, right? So let's go through this a bit, and we'll sort of tackle questions as we go. So let's say we look at the synthetic transactions. Whatever, why not? Who cares? So right, there's my rule. Let's go edit that sucker. Okay, so simply put, first one's just, well, we've already defined it, so we can't really edit it at this point because we've created the signal, if you will. But we can go and change the rules because maybe it's too sensitive, maybe it's not sensitive enough, right? The whole point of the AIM rules, and because it's a learning tool and you're learning the tool and all that stuff, sometimes it's a question of figuring out how do we set those thresholds for the right sensitivity so we get alerted of actual problems, but we don't get bombarded by false positives. And that's why we go and play with these things, right? So as I said before, we can have, it has to be at least this, right? And then it's got to be at least, one or the other of these. Like I said, most of the time I would just uncheck this and stick with a hard number, but that's just me, right? And then when do we declare an incident, right? There's a termination. So this is pretty much exactly like what I showed you in the slide, and the analysis tab and so on. Any questions on this process? You guys are all really getting this or hopelessly lost. I'm going to hope it's a former. Okay, so that's AIM in a nutshell, right? It looks complicated, but it's not really. It's just often sometimes requires a bit of tweaking over time, right? It just involves setting those thresholds, right? So maybe it's got to be at least a 3 or a 2 or whatever to determine, okay, well, that's not really a problem, but that is definitely a problem. How do we set that? And that's this, right? So, of course, in order for AIM to do its thing, we're at the top of the pyramid, right? That's where it's all automated. That's where it's all happening. But how can we tell you, accurate information about percentage of slow unless we actually have a meaningful value for SLT? Again, I always use an example, but 30-mile-an-hour speed limit sign at the Indy 500, useless, right? We need to make sure that it's representative of the traffic we want flowing through there, right? So meaningful speed limits, then of course we need to make sure that these speed limits are applied to actual pages, right? If our rules say that all cars have 18 axles, well, I can tell you that we're probably not applying the right speed limit because we're making false assumptions as to what is, a car. Then of course, in order to make that car or make that page, we obviously need to have some decent sessionization rules in place. So you see how the pyramid goes there? So proper sessionization, proper page building, proper SLTs, then we can set rules and we can set the threshold to make sure that we get properly alerted when something is actually broken, right? Because if it's all reds and stuff, then seriously something's wrong, right? Either something actually wrong with your applications or we haven't configured something the way we probably should. Okay? Cool. Let's get into the other fun stuff now. Okay. So LDAP, right? You don't want to necessarily always have to go create all these user accounts on your EUEM systems. You might want to tie it to, say, like an Active Directory server or something like that, right? Now, there's 2 modes we can use, right? If we're actually talking LDAP, we can use it for authentication only, where we just look to see whether the user exists, whether the password is okay. Then if it's correct, they'll log in based on whatever level that we've assigned to that rule, because it's not single sign-on. What happens is we actually have to tell the system to create an account when they log in, right? And we can control what level of access they initially have, right? So you might set it to no access, right? So the person tries to log in, they get denied, but that account now exists in there. So the security officer can go in and say, that person should be an admin, that person should be an observer, right? So that's fun and good, but it's a little bit labor intensive still, But what we can do beyond that is we can use authentication and authorization. In this particular case, depending on what container in the Active Directory the person falls into, right, whether it's like IT admin or like lowly accountant person, depending on which bubble they fall into, then we're going to map that container to a level of access, right, whether it's admin or observer or operator or what have you, okay? All right, so that's LDAP, okay? So it looks kind of like this. And then kind of like this, right? So this looks like a lot of gobbledygook. Usually what I do, since LDAP is a bit of a black art, unless you totally get it, which I don't, is I find another system that's using it and I copy it. It's pretty simple, right? Just one thing I can tell you for certain, for the user lookup for authentication, the username attribute for Windows Active Directory is SAM account name. I know this because I've done this. So There you go. Any questions on LDAP? Anyone actually using LDAP? Wow, crickets and tumbleweed. Okay,
Yes,
we'll take it as no. But
we are using it actually.
okay. So do you have any questions about this process, or is it pretty simple?
No, it's fine. It's fine.
Okay,
Thanks
cool.
for that.
Yay, someone actually is using LDAP. I like that. Okay, so back to our slideshow now. Okay, so that's LDAP. Come on, are you doing it? Oh, we're looking at the slides. I'm losing my mind. Okay, so session data storage. Remember how last time we defined how much retention we get based on those things? Well, we can actually have rules to control what gets written to, right? Now, that being said, this controls what actual records, object, page, and session get written to the raw database. That doesn't mean if we tell it not to be written there, it's not going to be considered part of the page building model and how we measure the length of pages, right? So it's possible, well, it's completely true that all of the traffic that we've deemed worthy of looking at is going to go towards our watch points and our reports and figuring out the numbers involved. But when we actually go use the session browser to dig into stuff, maybe some of all that stuff we don't care about, right? So, I mean, this is just my complete example, but let's say you say images, if it's a 200K, I don't care, right? Because it's an image, it's a static, like nobody cares, right? So we could not store that if we wanted to, if there's a lot of images, and that might save us some space. Probably not a whole heck of a lot, but you get the idea, right? So we can store all the traffic. We can store just the session summaries, right? So we could, if we wanted to, know, oh, this session had this many pages, this many errors, took this long overall. But unfortunately, if we do that, we can't actually drill down. If I try and go drill into the pages below that, it's going to say, sorry, I don't have that information, right? So maybe that's probably a little bit draconian. Instead, we could say traffic that matches certain rules, right? So we could say only store the pages that have to do with certain watch points, or we could say, you know, that sort of thing. So then we have custom rules in addition to the initial filtering. So the custom rules, that's going to be things, like I said, like the images and the whatever. We can set up these fancy filters to choose what we want in the database and what we don't want in the database. And the only way this affects us is both for using the session browser and if we're going to go and export that data and give it something else like a reporting solution or whatever. Okay? All right, so storage statistics. So in addition to knowing how much retention we have, we're also going to talk about things like data integrity and session profiles and all that stuff. So let's go look at that. That's a fun little page. Okay, so that's going to be under data flow settings. This is how the data is controlled again. So it's going to be under, under session data storage, right? So up here, we can say session summaries only. I don't think there's much value in that personally. Or we could store stuff that matches following rules. So the following rules might be things, store only the pages with errors, or store only those that match certain watch points, right? Or we could do even other things, right? Like following storage rules. So we could set up, say, you know, any expression we want, and then we could either ignore it or grab it, right? So in this case, down in the object storage rules, right? We're storing everything except for the fav icons. No one wants fav icons, so we said if the URL contains fav icon, we're going to discard that, right? So that's, again, what gets in, what does not, right? So based on those rules I've set up, because we're storing everything, well, guess what? 100% of the pages were stored because we didn't have any rules to not store some of them, right? And because of that, we're also keeping 100% of our objects because, well, apparently we're not seeing fav icon, I can tell you that, right? So that's that. See, down here, we can actually see how much retention we actually have. We can see that we actually have 8 days. So the oldest record is going to be 8 days old for pages and objects, but because the traffic flow is decreased, the estimated rollover is now 35 days, right? So it's always going to try and guess how much retention we can have based on what we saw in the past and based on the current flow of traffic into the device, right? Now, more often than not, we're going to have more retention for session summaries than we do for pages and objects because of the ratios involved, right? Each session is going to have more than one page. Each page will have more than one object. So it stands to reason that we're going to have more pages and objects than we have sessions. So the session records are going to take longer to roll out, okay? Because as we know, it's all based on size, and that's how the purging works. Okay, right. So that's that.
Question.
Yes.
What determines the ratio between sessions and pages? And is that adjustable?
Well, not really, right? Because keep in mind, to define a session, right, we're going to look for all of the hits that had a given value for a specific tag, right? So we're going to lump all that together, right? So that's how the amount of pages or the amount of objects we have in our session, right? Now, some of these objects are going to be grouped into pages, right, because they're containers and components and so on. Some of them might not. Maybe they're documents. Maybe they're other things, right? But it's just the nature of the beast, right? Like, you might, if your sessionization is completely busted, yeah, every session only has one object in it, right? It's probably not being done terribly well, because I don't imagine that people go and hit your site and look at one thing and that's it, right? So,
right, but in our case, I just looked at our system.
Yep.
We're keeping sessions for 36 days. We're keeping objects and pages for only 2 days. And I was just wondering, is there a way to sacrifice some of the session storage?
Well, that's a little bit tricky, right? Because it's all based on space, right? So it's just a function of, I'm not sure the exact rule. I don't think they're modifiable, but the exact rules for how we store that, right?
Arbitrarily allocate more storage? Will it just automatically start using it, or is there a fixed amount of storage that's
Well, that's a very good question. You know what? I'm gonna take that offline because that's a very good question. So who's asking that? That's Don. Okay. Yeah. Gotcha. So Don Brenner. Okay. So that's a very good idea, because imagine if, well, okay. Here's the thing, right? Do you ever go and look for a Joblo session? Do you ever say, show me the arid sessions, right? Do you ever do that, or do you say, go show me the arid pages, right?
Generally, having a session without the pages is not that much useful. Maybe a couple of days worth, but we don't a lot.
Okay.
The first thing we do is then drill down, okay, what's the page that's causing the issue?
Okay. Now, I'm not sure, I don't think it's possible to set how many, it'd be kind of cool if we could just say, well, don't bother storing more sessions than we have, all pages and objects for. That would make sense. I don't think we can do that. But I'm wondering whether it's possible to actually not have session records, right? Now,
we definitely want session records. We don't want to get rid of them.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't think that's confirmable, but I'll find out.
Add storage. Can we bump this up just by adding storage?
Oh, well, here's the problem, right? Because that database is actually a MySQL 5 or 6 now, 5 or 6 database, right? So those databases are extremely, well, fragile is one way of putting it, but the thing, in order for the purging mechanism to work, to clean out these tables and stuff, to make more room for more stuff coming in, it needs to know exactly how much space it has to play with, right? So unfortunately, if you're going to replace that drive with a larger drive, we have to sort of sacrifice the data we had there. Well, there might be some long, drawn-out methods of storing it, but we'd have to sacrifice that, recreate the new database structure on the new volume, and then that would fill up as we go, right?
That sacrifice are reports or just
No. That's just the raw data, right? Now, because the aggregated summary data, that's just 90 days worth, right? And it's relatively small. I don't think it's much bigger than like 200 megs, maybe most. So that's teensy, right? But that is independent of the raw database. Right?
Okay.
So we're still going to have that.
So as long as we retain the reports, I think we might be willing to sacrifice our raw database.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. But we'd have to do certain things, right? We'd have to make sure we take a backup of the summary data, because unfortunately that secondary drive does store more than just the raw data. It also stores the summary data, the AIM data, all the other fun stuff as well. So as long as we go through the steps of making sure we keep that stuff, then by all means we can go and shut the VM down, rip away the drive, then put in a new one, start her up again, create the database structure, and away we go, right? And then we just restore from the backup. Yep.
What, is there an administrative information here to get the capacity of this thing? Like, is the VM running out of CPU? Is it running out of memory?
Well, we haven't gotten there yet, but I can just jump right ahead now. So if we go look at the, well, that's fine. I don't mind doing things in not the order. I'm sort of funny that way. So if we go to the System Info and Licenses page, well, one place we can look at it is right here, right? So we can see the CPU average. We can see the total session disk space. So well, this one's teensy, but it's got like 61 gigs of total, session data space. We're only using 51 gigs. We can see the memory available, the used memory, all that fun stuff. That's one way. Another way is the CLI command. If ever you SSH onto the analyzer, you can do system state, I believe it is, and it's actually going to show you like where we're at, right? And there's other commands we could do to see numbers like that. But anytime you want to see that sort of stuff, I'd recommend going here. You can see which license you have. Pay no attention to this diagnostic thing, because this was made back in the days of the TS1200s, and it's all meaningless now and being replaced by the alarms. I don't know why we still keep it, but I guess it's like a disappearing get snapshot button. It's like a feature at this point, but there you have it, right? So here we can see how we're doing in terms of that. Now, on top of having to go here, of course, the system is constantly monitoring its own health, right? So if it does get to the point where it's having to swap to hard drive, that's kind of bad. It's going to tell you. It's going to shoot an email alert and say, hey, by the way, we're having troubles, right? So that's, the system is extremely aware of itself, very aware of itself, maybe almost too much sometimes, because I know people get a bit quirky sometimes, but it's like, no, it's telling you it's doing stuff, right? But the system will definitely let you know if it's running into problems like that.
Yeah, is there any way to get the CPU usage for more than 1 minute, or do I have to just keep sampling it?
There's better ways of doing that. That's going to be via the CLI. Unfortunately, not within the framework of this class. But I'll see about sending you a little. I'll create a little ticket and I'll send you some info about the CLI commands, and they're pretty cool.
Okay.
Yeah, CLI commands. What's a good one? Get stats. I like.
It's like I'm looking at ours. It looks like we're using all the memory.
Well.
Or is that normal?
Would you want it? Would you want it to not use all the memory? That's why you gave it the memory, right?
How do we know if it's title? Just go use it anyway.
Well, yeah. I mean that's why the alarms will tell you if it's getting weird. But as you know, like looking at just one thing, well, maybe you want to look at it from different angles, right? You might want to look at your VM logs as well and say, well, how are we doing in terms of like resources? Is it having to steal from other VMs and so on? So there's different things we can do, right? So. But again, just looking at the one thing, it's always good to use what I like to say is each of the tools we have in our bag of tools, right, as IT people, right, provide more illumination than what we're looking at, right? It's like almost like in old books they would consider all the pictures illuminations, right, because they illustrate what we're looking at, right? The more illumination we have, the more light on the subject, the closer we are to the truth of whatever that thing is, right? Am I getting too poetic there? Hopefully that's okay. All right, cool. So. Don, are you okay?
Yeah. I mean, we can take some of this offline.
Yeah. Well, like I said, I'm just getting your feet wet.
Some of our analyzers do run into trouble. I think there's somewhere where you can display the data flow, and we're having where collectors are dropping data.
Oh, right. Okay. So there's different reasons for that, and we can definitely have a little session on that. We'll open a ticket for that. Okay. So there's different ways of figuring out when the system's having problems, right? Like, say for example, on the collector, you might get alarms saying that it's dropping packets at the ring buffer, right? What that means is the actual capture interfaces are like drowning. It's like trying to drink from the fire hose, right? Whereas if there's problems on the analyzer in terms of not having enough resources, the easiest way of doing that is if you're on a report and at the bottom of the report says, hey, by the way, during that time frame, I had to drop 0.2% of the traffic because I couldn't grab it all because I was sampling, right?
And we do periodically, but so far Reboot has pretty much cleared it out every time.
Oh, really? God, I don't like the sound of that. But okay.
Now, so collector problems, the Reboot doesn't seem to solve it.
Well, yeah. So, there's different things going on there, right? There's the capture and the blah, and then all the analyzing of stuff, right? So, of course, with sampling, and we're going to get there very shortly. Well, we're getting there. The sampling just means that we were able to process all the traffic that we saw with the resources we had on hand, right? That could be. Well, let's go ahead. Oh, anyway, I'm just going to talk to you guys. Okay, so sampling, let's say that it's just because, well, hey, too much traffic, right? Or maybe it's because those resources were busy doing something else, right? Maybe someone was running a massive, big session browser query. So, yeah, the system had trouble writing everything because some dude was like, well, can you show me the thing with the other thing? I'm like, ugh. So we have to consider that. Or maybe there was a purge happening. Or maybe someone made a massive change to the configs and the system kind of went, like, hold on a second, right? So we have to consider all these things when we're trying to investigate what's going on, right? Now, obviously, we have logs for that sort of thing, right? So there's actually even a really cool hidden page, and I'm not going to show you guys here, but there's a hidden page where you can go, and if you have sampling, it's going to say, we sampled because we saw this, right? We can correlate it with other things, right? Config changes or purges or queries or whatever, right? So if we do have sampling, we definitely can get to the heart of that, right? With the extended diagnostics, with the hidden pages, we can definitely figure out why is the system choking, right? And we can determine, well, there's not enough RAM, there's not enough CPU. We just throw more stuff at it, right? That's the great thing about virtual. We're not stuck with our little toaster. We can just throw more RAM, throw more CPU, throw more stuff, right? Now, that's not to say go completely hog wild with your configs and just go nuts and do everything under the sun. We want to have an efficiency there, right? Same thing with your own applications. We want to make sure the code is doing what we want. We're ignoring stuff we don't care about. We're focusing on stuff we do care about, and we're doing meaningful things to show us things, right? Like, for example, I had another customer, I don't mention names obviously, but for some bizarre reason they were storing every single query and post parameter, but they were hashing it, right? So they don't even know what it was. They're just storing it all as like gobbledygook. Why not just delete it if you're not going to use it, right? Like the only time you'd ever want to hash something is that if you want to know there's a value there and you want to make sure it doesn't change halfway through the session, that's why you'd hash it, right? Because for whatever legal reasons, you can't show the patient number or whatever. But there's a huge and that's one of the things I want to try and push on you guys during these classes, is to really be as conscious and awake as you guys can be about this, to really make the most of those resources, of the storage, of the everything, right? Because the more efficient we are in how we do things, the more those resources can be brought to bear on the stuff we actually care about. Okay? All right, back to the script. All right, back to the script. Okay, so security settings, right? So the security officer obviously has more power than anyone else, right? The idea behind there is the security officer is the person who makes sure everything is the way it should be, right? We often get the questions like, well, is your box like blah, blah, blah compliant? Well, that's up to you, right? Because keep in mind that the security officer is completely in control of what SSL traffic gets decrypted, what cookies, post parameters, blah, 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 we actually store into the database, who can do, well, not who, but like which custom, primitive extractions can be done, right? You don't want some jerk just come along and like, oh, I can extract a credit card number from this page. Like, if that sort of extraction happens, the security officer can set it so that so any new extractions that are created, he can either say, yes, that's perfectly okay, or screw you, that's not good, we're not going to allow that, right? So the security officer is complete control over what data winds up on the box, right? So credit card numbers and whatever numbers and all that stuff that could potentially be sensitive and in no way helps us with our troubleshooting investigation really shouldn't be stored on the system, right? And that's why we have things like the confidentiality policies and the SSL and the whatnot, right? Because people are always sort of paranoid about, well, my data, well, you control it, right? That's pretty much the bottom line. Okay, so obviously all the things about accounts and so on, pre-login messages and password expiry and all that fun stuff. Key management is super important. We're going to go there, and confidentiality policy. So let's go and look at that. I like that bit. I don't know if we're going over or not, but hopefully you're all just really excited and interested in what we're doing. Okay, so go away, WebEx. Come on, stop. Collector. Okay, so here we go. So obviously as a security officer, I have more power than anyone else. So I come along here, and I will look at the key management. Now, I'll tell you right off the bat, that this is demo box with fake traffic. Don't expect any miracles on this page. So the first thing, like the sessionization, we're going to see the status, right? We're going to see how much of it is clear text. Not a whole heck of a lot on this horrible, horrible box. But, we can see how much is clear text, and we can also see how much of it is encrypted, right? Now, if we were successfully encrypting any of it, it would be green. So we'd have X% would be successfully decrypted SSL stuff, right? Now, notice how we have other protocol, right? Other protocol just means other stuff, right? Maybe like databases talking to each other, whatever. As you all know by now, the only thing that we can actually process is HTTP and HTTPS information, right? And one further is that if it's SSL encrypted and we can't decrypt it, we can't even tell if it's HTTPS. It could be God knows what, right? So we would have to decrypt it and then know whether or not it's HTTPS or other protocol, right? Now, if we don't have a key, we don't have a key, right? But you might notice this ugly thing here, unsupported cipher. Now, where we're at today in the world, there are certain key encryption algorithms that are impossible for any passive, completely passive, third-party monitoring application to decrypt, right? Because they're using complex math and stuff to create a temporary handshake, and then they just sort of run away, right? So we can't guess how they've made that handshake, and we can't decrypt it, right? So we can totally survive on a high encryption RSA stuff. That's great. So if you want to monitor that traffic, you need to make sure that SSL traffic is in a format that we can actually decrypt where we're sitting with the private key, right? So that's my little preaching on the unsupported cipher, okay? So what happens next, right? Well, obviously, we're going to need to have keys. We don't have any on here, demo box, whatever. So we'd have keys, right? So we'd have this key, that key, the other key. But just having the keys there doesn't necessarily when we're going to start decrypting. In order to do that, we need to create some IP mappings. And the way the IP mappings work, I know there's none, but what you'd say is if I see IP for this traffic, for this IP, use that key. If you see it for that IP, use that key. Or if you're really lazy, because we have that superpower now, you could say if I see SSL traffic for star.star.star.star, you figure out which one of my keys, and I'll just throw all the keys into that mapping, and the system will do the work of looking at the handshake and go, oh, that key, oh, this key. So that's what we do with the IP mappings, right? Now, what is this thing all about, right? So let's say I got some traffic, I know it's all of it, that wasn't being decrypted. I come over here and I'd look at this, right? And I could, maybe if I wanted to, sort it by percentage of secure traffic. So I know these two suckers are, like, we see a lot of SSL traffic for them. So I could either look at this list and say, ooh, that's important, make sure I get the key, create a mapping, all that stuff, decrypt it, I'm happy. Or I might go, this guy, like, oh, Christ, I don't even like that guy. So you could go and exclude that in the inclusion-exclusion rules, right? So we don't even bother trying to decrypt it, right? Why waste resources trying to decrypt it when I don't even have that the key for that thing on my keychain, right? Don't bother, right? Okay, so that's the encryption, or the SSL encryption stuff, kind of fun. Let's go to the confidentiality policies, right? So this is very interesting because in addition to any content extraction we might do, there's certain things that exist that we will do certain things with, right? So that's cookies, post parameters, query parameters, and path parameters, right? Now you'll notice that there are 4 actions that can happen. Do nothing means get on the truck, we don't care. Just whatever, you're coming with us, right? Delete value means, and delete value is probably the one I want to use if your organization is a little bit sensitive about info, but you're still not too sure which things we have to play with. If you do delete value, at least I know the keys. I'm like, ooh, you know, credit card number, I don't want that. Ooh, okay, that one I want. Okay, that one. So we can then, once we've identified them, then we can create a rule for that specific one. Let's say we're talking about JS Session ID, to then keep that, right? If I say delete, just delete outright, it means I don't even know the key passed. I don't even know it was there, right? In terms of what I have in my database, I don't know. So that's probably the best way of keeping things clean, right? Once we've established all the cookies or whatever we want, then we can create rules for them and then have our default value, right, all others, be delete, right? Like I said, hash, it's using a fixed complex hash to turn, you know, potato into blah, 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 right? So again, it's limited value, but it's good to know that there is a value there and to know whether or not that value changed throughout the course of this session, right? So that's kind of fun. Okay, any questions on the confidentiality policies or the SSL stuff? I will take that as a no. All right, let's keep on going. All right. All that. So backups, right? What can we back up? So we can manage the configs, right? We can actually go to the main administration page, and there's actually a little button called Manage Configurations, right? So you can download the device configuration, security configuration. We'll talk about what that means in a second. We could even, back up, the summary and report data if we wanted to. It's we can provide a backup for that, and we can set up some policies for it. The raw data, I probably wouldn't recommend it, right? Because that's a big pile of stuff. That's a big dumpster full of stuff. And obviously, if we're going to be pulling that off somehow, we'd probably pretty much have to turn traffic capture off, because do you really want to try and pull something off as the back end of it being overwritten? Probably not, right? So it is possible using the export command to actually pull out that sucker, but I definitely wouldn't do it at a higher, at a rotation, So I wouldn't do that. Okay, system keys. Can you back them up? No. Right, that would be totally, unsafe if people could just like, ooh, I'll just download the SSL keys off the EUEM machine. No, you can install them, you can delete them. That's your 2 options. That is all. Okay. All right, live configuration. No, I'm not going to show you that. It's basically just a big XML file with stuff in it. But if ever you're curious, you can always download it and have a look. And if you want to talk about it, we can do that, right? So on the system, all of it lives in the form of TrueSite-cfg.xml, right? Now, if I export that, what the system does, I can export that in 2 different ways. I can download the device configuration or the security configuration. So what it's going to do is it's going to pull out the relevant bits for each of those, right? So the device configuration is obviously like watch points, errors, performance metrics, blah, 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 all that stuff. Whereas security config is just traffic capture, whether it's on or off, SSH, whether it's on or off, and the confidentiality policies, right? So the control over what actually gets written to the database, right? So important to have both if we're going to play with that. Okay, so yeah, no, none of that. Okay, so we do have the export command, as I said, right? Now, you can export the just the summary data in the configs, which is what I'd recommend, using the export -W, right? -W means don't grab all the raw data, which makes much more sense because that will take you far less time, whereas this will really impact the system, right? Imagine you actually still have traffic capture on, and it's actually still right into the database as you're pulling out. No, just don't even do it, right? So it's crazy. Okay, and you can actually do it via SCP or TFTP. It's kind of cool, right? So TFTP, SCP, whatever you want to do. Okay, so right, so now we're going to talk about the system info and license page, which we got a sneak preview on because of Don. So the different things we can see there, right? We got the LCD panel, which probably doesn't make a whole lot of sense for the analyzer because who cares? But at least on the collector, we can see things like, well, I mean, there's other things, but one of the main things I look at is the capture interfaces, right? If someone says, well, I'm not seeing traffic, if I go to the LCD panel and look at the ports on the collector and everything either says 0 or unplugged, well, there's no traffic coming in, right? That's as low as we can get. If that shows 0 or unplugged, there's no one coming in the front door, so no point looking any further, right? Traffic overview exists only on the collector, obviously, and that is going to give us an idea of the health of the traffic we're looking at. Because as we know, ideally, in a perfect world, we want to have healthy, bidirectional HTTP, HTTPS traffic correctly being decrypted, right? And that will give us an idea of how that's looking, right? The TCP session over, what the heck is all that about? Capture rates, SSL. Okay, so let's do that. Oh, really? Package? Okay, so let's go look at that page. Does it talk about the traffic?
And where can we, and where can we view the database, means the external database information? Is there a mechanism in the GUI?
Well, it's not really an external database, right? It's actually it's completely internal, right? It just happens to be using the drive we've attached to it as its storage, right? So you can't actually access the database externally, right? You can export it using that export command we just looked at, and that's going to essentially do a MySQL dump of that database, which you can do whatever you want with, right? But there's no real way to access that.
Okay, there is no way directly to access that, right?
Nope, no, absolutely not. It's all from within. Yeah, it's not like, because I don't know if you guys have played with the extended reporting solution where you're using your own Oracle database and whatever. This is all sort of internal to the tool. And obviously, there's reasons for that, right? Because this is such an intensive process, right? I mean, it's the same reason why you want to make sure when you're setting up these VMs to have reservations for your resources, right? Because this thing is supposed to be chewing, crunching all the time, right? So if it's doing that and suddenly some other VM steals half the RAM and half the CPU, like imagine your DNS server, right? Imagine that didn't have all the resources it wanted to and people are trying to surf the internet, you know? So this thing is up all the time doing its thing. We really can't afford to have anyone poking at it from the outside, right? Just because of how intensely the raw database is being written to, right? That's why we do a lot of limitation, right? For example, with a session browser, we limit you to 5,000 records, right? Because we don't want you to keep poking at that, right? Grab your stuff, go look at it, but let the thing do its job, right? The system's primary job is to grab the traffic, analyze the traffic, and write it to the database so we have that story, right? So, like I said, you know, the MySQL database is fragile. You know, we want to make sure we're not bugging it. We want to make it's a very high-performance, high-power tool, but you know, we have to take care of it. We can't just sort of let people poke at it, right? Okay, license information, okay, so all that stuff. Okay, is that good? Are you okay?
Yeah, actually, we are making use of the PAE engine actually. So I was wondering that is connected to NAS storage. So I wanted to see where if we have something on the GUI where we can see.
Well, it's a little bit different, right? Because the PAE is a different beast. The PAE is much more, well, I'm not going to say loosey-goosey, but the PAE is actually just writing stuff in the form of binary flat files, right? Which is nowhere near as delicate as the SQL. So it's just writing folders and writing files and so on. So that you can go look at it. You can even muck around with it and copy stuff to it if you really wanted to, and then go query it, right? But I know in the past people have often said, well, you don't need the session browser, you get the PAE. They're two totally different tools, right? The PAE is about showing you the problems. There's the problem, right? Whereas the session browser is a much more surgical tool, right? It's about doing those very focused queries, right? Because I can tell you right now, if you're looking for, you know, Mary's session at 2 o'clock when she was doing that thing, if you try and find that PE, you'll have a heck of a time, right? Because that's not what the PE is showing you. The PE is like a radar. The session browser is like a microscope. So each of them have their own very special uses, right? They have their own superpowers, their own caveats. So we need to keep that in mind, right? So, but I know some people, because they don't care about John's sessions and Mary's sessions and whatever, they've actually, believe it or not, they've actually turned off the session browser. They're not even storing it. They're using the PE exclusively to go and find the problems, right? For them, in terms of the story they need, they don't need that story of John went to the store and he did the thing and the other thing and he left. They don't need that, right? They just want to know that dynamic content is problematic, that, you know, place is having problems, that, you know. So it's a different way of looking at the problem, right? Now, I would say, because the session browser has so much value for me anyway and for troubleshooting things, I would use a session browser to be able to analyze things and figure out how do we set all this stuff up, right? That's what we're going to learn, which cookies are being passed, what, you know, what's going on. Maybe eventually, once you've made sure that the story you're telling is completely accurate to what your needs are, then maybe you don't need the session browser, but maybe you do, right? So each of them have their own powers, right? So I'm going to say that, but it's primarily just a function of how that data is being stored, right? Binary flat files, very robust, versus MySQL, more fragile, but, you know, much higher. You know, because the PAE can get that data whenever. It's going to go and pull it. And well, I mean, obviously it's going to pull it off fast enough and so on. But the analyzer is really where the story is being created, right? Where we're grouping these things into sessions, into pages. We're writing those records, right? And that's the thing that's creating the thing that the other tools, the offline tools like the PAE, are then going to reference their own versions of that data to provide you with the answers. Is that cool?
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, no problem. Okay, so, we're already on my collector. That's good. So let's go look at my friend, the System Info Licenses page. Now, like I said, the analyzer has stuff in it as well. It's going to have all the licenses that you have, all the resources that are going on. It's going to have, you know, you can even tell what the MAC addresses and stuff are and all the IP information, and also which version, right, at the bottom. So you always note that there's a rescue image, that the rescue image lives outside of the OSs of the two other images, right? It's just sort of there so we can go and manage things. We can delete things, reinstall things, but you'll probably never be booting into rescue. That's something we do as support, right? The two things we look at are the system slots, right? The one that's important is the one that's highlighted in blue, right? So the one highlighted in blue should hopefully be the higher number of the two, right? Because that's the current one we're running, whereas this is the old one. If we were to go and upgrade this to 2.7, then we would install it into the system 1 slot and we'd have it there. The idea there is that let's say something goes disastrously wrong in the upgrade, we could, with a bit of, you know, banging of monkey wrenches and stuff, go and roll back to the other version, right, if something went horribly wrong. It's just about having safety and just doing things in a way that minimizes the impact, right? We want to make sure that we can always go back if something happened, right? Okay, so the important thing in here, we can cycle the LCD to other things. If, like I said, traffic hits per second. Oh, that's kind of cool. I forgot about all this stuff. So we can see the memory. So Dawn, remember all the stuff you're talking about? Look, stuff. So there's fun things to play with in there. So we got all that. We got the versions and so on. But the one I care about on the collector anyway is this, right? In this case, we just have one capture interface, but if I had a bunch of them, I would know whether they have numbers, meaning they have data, or whether they're all zeros are unplugged, meaning, well, there's no data, right? So that's what's going on there. Okay, so I'm going to move away from the script. Let's go on to the next thing that I like here, which is the traffic capture status, right? Because this tells us a bit of things, but I want to know, like, is my traffic healthy? And I have a funny feeling it looks like hell on this box, but you'll get the idea, right? So what can we surmise from this page? We can see things like, oh, there's one last thing I forgot to mention about the other page. If we ever ask you what the serial number of the unit is, it's this, the ID. TSVT, blah, 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 right? So it's always going to start with TS something. That identifies that unit to us. It's pretty much the only way that we think about that entity in our CRM and the devices that you have under your org, right? So that's that. Okay, cool. So let's go back to my friend. Okay, so over here we can see that, okay, so not a whole heck of a lot, right? So we can see how much of it's IP traffic, not a lot. We can see how much of it's TCP, right? And we can see how much of it is actual HTTP and encrypted, right? So we know we have zero, oh, that's funny, zero SSL and, oh, okay, it's true because it's now, right? So we can see that. We can also see what the TCP sessions look like, right? So we want to know how much are encrypted and whether there are any resets. I'm seeing 100% reset. Doesn't look very good to me. We hopefully want that lower. We can also see the SSL, right? How much of it is new, restored, how much of it is failed. And we can also look at the capture rate, right? So we can see right now I've got 0 hits per second. So hopefully your number is bigger than that, right? Hopefully, also, you have more processed than you have broken, right? Now, broken just means stuff we couldn't process. Some of that might not actually be broken. For example, TCP prefetching might open a TCP connection and there's no payload. That's a broken hit for us because we couldn't do anything with it, right? So if ever you wanted more detail on what the broken stuff was, let us know. We'll jump on a WebEx with you and we can run a command called traffic status, and it's going to give us a breakdown of the broken traffic so we can know where our problem is, right? Last but not least on this page, we've got the SYN-ACK ratio. Again, I mentioned we want to have completely bidirectional traffic. If we see these numbers not being 0 or being high, it means that we're only seeing half of it or maybe double of one of the sides, right? So we're simply just counting the SYNs versus the SYN-ACKs and the SYN-ACKs versus the client-ACKs. So in theory, it should be 0, right? We shouldn't have more of one than the other, right? We got a little bit, but that could be anything, right? So I'm not too worried about that. Okay, back to the slideshow. Oh God, we went half an hour over. Hope you guys are okay. Right. So there's a bunch of APIs that we can use to stream out that data. There's one called the bulk data export, and that's good if ever you didn't have a PAE, but you wanted to pull that data before it rolls out. What you could do is you could use a get export API to go pull out the data, say last 5 minutes every 5 minutes or last 2 hours every 2 hours, and go pull it out, and then you could look at it in Excel, put it in your own MySQL database, do whatever the heck you want, and you'd be happy. Okay. All right. So. Right, so SNMP, we can support 1, 2C, and 3. So that is good for things like streaming OIDs for the watch points. We can pick a watch point, pick a metric, and pick a calculation, whether it's average, percentile, or whatever. Or we can do traps, right? And so traps come in terms of the error detection rules and also the AIM alerts, right? So that's what's going on with that, and all this stuff. You'll have all this for reference, so you'll be fine. Okay. And okay, so sampling we mentioned, it's just when there's not enough resources to handle what we're looking at, right? So could be for a number of reasons. We can always investigate that if you're in fact seeing sampling. Data retention we've also discussed, right? It's how much raw data we're able to keep based on the rules we have in place and the nature of the traffic we're looking at, okay? Purging. Systems need to make room for more data coming in. For summary database, if it's older than 90 days, gone, next day comes in. For the raw database is all size-based, right? So if we're over, I think, like 98% full or whatever, we're going to get rid of the older stuff so the new stuff can roll in. Okay. Reference list, it's just, well, I would like to say it's a dumb RAM counter. It's more than that, but it's just a way of seeing what are we seeing, right? So I could run a reference on server ID, and there's all my server IDs, which look like server IPs, and how often they showed up, right? So this is to show us what's on the wire, right? And here's all the variables. So I'm not going to talk about all this stuff because you can read it, okay? So I will say, half an hour late, that you have all survived the advanced configuration training. Any closing questions before we run away?
Is there documentation for everything you just kind of discussed?
Well, there is this, right? There's a slideshow. There's also the product documentation. So yeah, there's definitely that. But this, I find this slideshow with the recording will probably be a much better use to than, because you've got me who's been playing with this tool for like 10 years. So, so hopefully that will help.
I'm obviously an expert at it.
Well, I've been doing it for a while. But yeah, the thing about documentation is, it's kind of it takes a while to get it all out there and ironed out and sensical. So yeah, well, I mean, we have different things, right? We have the slideshow, we have the product documentation on the doc site, we even have all our KAs, right? So if ever you have like a question or whatever, you can go and look and ask a question, and hopefully you'll get like a meaningful KA that will explain something, right? There's a bunch of really good ones. I've even written some of them, and of course there's also the communities, right? Where a lot of people who use our product might go there and discuss things, or even we discuss things. I know Chris is always squawking on the communities. I keep forgetting. I don't even know what my password is anymore, but you get the idea. So yeah, so it's all there. We have all the information. Whatever doesn't exist, we can help you with. Whatever does exist and might be hard to find, we can also point you in the right direction too. Sound good?
As far as this PowerPoint, is that something you'll be sending out?
Absolutely. I will send that momentarily, even to the people who didn't show. Oh yeah, we'll have all that. Okay.
Yeah, and one basic question actually, I just wanted to know, is there a way how to find out which collectors are which
collectors are what?
think we may have lost him.
Oh, no. I wish I knew the end of that question. It'd be difficult. Which collectors are what? Yeah, he fell off. Oh. Okay. Well, I'll shoot him an email.
I kind of came late. I didn't catch your name.
Oh, Catherine Welford. Yeah.
Catherine Welford.
Yeah, I work with Chris and Alex here, and of course we got our U.S. people down in the States. So yeah, one happy little family. So lots of fun. Okay, all right, gang. So you'll get the email provided you're all on the list of registered class people I have here. And like I said, if you have any questions you didn't think about while we're doing this, and you look over the info and you're like, oh wait, please feel free to open up a ticket, ask us questions. We're more than happy to. I could literally explain this stuff all day long. I'd much rather do this than deal with broken stuff. Yeah, right in the car, is that you?
Sorry, Christian. Yeah, he just dropped off suddenly. Okay, I was just asking, is there a way to find out which analyzers are pointing to which collector in the GUI?
Well, okay, so what you can do is in each analyzer, oh, we didn't look at that. Let's go share that. Just one close-in thing, right? So let's go to the analyzer. What we can do there is we can do two things, right? If we go to the home base of the collector, we can see which analyzers are feeding from us, and apparently not. So this one's not even configured. But down below what we're capturing here, you'd see what's being delivered, right? So you'd see this analyzer, the other analyzer, the one below that. And on the analyzer, I have to do this because Alex wouldn't let me play with his collectors, but whatever. If we go here, Analyzer and Collector Management, there I can see which collectors I have, right? So I'll have these collector feeds. So my A1, A docs, and so that's how we see how it all maps together. So hopefully, if you don't know how it's all set up, you can come here and look at it and then come up with your own map based on that. So you know which analyzers correspond with what collectors, assuming, of course, that this name means anything. If it doesn't, what you can probably do is go to collector feed settings, and then you can actually see, this is the IP of it, right? So many ways to skin a cat.
Okay, yeah.
Okay?
Yeah, thank you.
All right, gang. So you're very welcome. So like I said, if you guys have any questions, please feel free to shoot us a call or email or whatever, open up a ticket, and we'll be more than happy to help. Okay? So.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
Okay, you're very welcome, guys. Take care. Cheers.